Hey everybody, hope you all are doing well. How about this thing that Garfield County has put on? Pretty great, right? Kirby and the rest of the Garfield County folks, I think, have done an awesome job. I really enjoyed the steak fry last night and meeting many of you at that and the after party. So glad to be here. As he mentioned, I've got a ton of material, so I'm going to try to move really fast. Let's start with just an introduction real quick. Enverus, and by the way, let me settle the controversy. I heard there was is it Enverus or Enverus debate? It is Enverus. So it's, the word breaks down, by the way, EN's for energy, it's all we do. Ver is to see truth, and us is together, because we can't do that without working with all of you. So our mission is powering the global quality of life. We have quite a lot of employees and customers in Colorado. So this state is important to us in carrying out that mission. And I should point out that we can't do that without helping you. You are the energy producers. We're merely helping you get that job done as well as you can. So unless you're successful and we're helping you do that, we can't achieve our mission, which is powering the global quality of life. So I just thought I'd point those things out about us. Colorado is also important to me. It's always been a place of adventure and renewal and kind of personal growth. And you can see me there and my reaction to the meltwater temperature on the Arkansas that day. I think 16 years later, my body temperature is finally back to normal. That was a fun ride. The next day, I climbed Pikes Peak, and I don't know about y'all, but that look back east is one of the most awe-inspiring things that I've ever seen. And I've summited several times. I need to do it again soon. It's been a long time. But Colorado has always been special to me, also personally. And I have to be candid. I'm worried about you guys. And I'm going to explain why here in a minute. But first, I want to point out that nothing that I present is financial advice. That's important. We talk to a lot of investors for a lot of reasons, but nothing that I talk about today will be financial advice. And also, the opinions expressed today are mine and mine alone. Enverus is not a policy commentator. We stay strictly away from making commentary on the goodness or badness of any public policy, and for good reason, because if we appeared partisan or biased in any way, customers would lose trust in us, which they would be right to do, and so that's something that we strictly avoid. I'm also, however, a private citizen who's passionate about energy very much for the United States, and so I'm going to express some of those opinions today. Those are mine, not those of my colleagues. Okay, so Colorado in context: energy, power, reality, and responsibility. Here's my concern against this agenda, and I'm going to walk through it. As I prepared for this event, it became a much different presentation than I thought it was going to be. And my overall summation, after talking to a couple dozen people, including many operators and many others, and reviewing many, many data sources, is that Colorado has an abundance of energy and a scarcity of understanding it. And unfortunately, I think that runs the risk of several things going wrong. One is essentially sliding into a kind of a de facto ban of the oil and gas industry. Another one is reducing available generation resources, destabilizing the grid, and raising electricity prices. And then finally, even stopping or reversing progress towards lower emissions in the state's energy economy. So I'm going to walk through why I believe that those things are risks for Colorado and in what context. Energy, it's harder than it should be. Both to produce it and to understand it. And I'm going to go through some of that here. These are symbols that I'm going to use throughout the presentation to represent primary energy sources: coal, hydro, oil, wind, gas, solar, nuclear, and geothermal. So when you see those, that's what they are. Just thought I'd give a little key there. So harder than it should be to understand. Let's take a look at this. These are data from mostly the U.S. Energy Information Administration and a couple cases in Enverus where we had slightly more current data. But we've got 12.4 million short tons of coal, 187 million barrels of oil, 1.6 TCF of gas. You see the million megawatt hours of wind, solar, and hydro. How do we relate all those things together? It's a lot of different units doing a lot of different things in the Colorado energy system. How do we make it purposeful and understandable to something that we could actually conceive and make decisions about? Well, this very confusing looking thing is like an amazing energy Rosetta Stone. It's published by the Lawrence Livermore National Labs. This one is specific to Colorado. And what it shows is essentially on the left, all primary energy consumption in all forms over here. And over on the right, the delivery of energy services by sector, residential, commercial, industrial, transportation. And it includes both the total energy services received, meaning actual work done to produce things and make life better, and the rejected energy, which is essentially thermal waste. As we all know, no energy use is perfectly efficient, and it is just a fact of thermodynamics that some of the energy that we use goes into waste heat and the rest is available to make work and do good things. So this chart is super cool and super useful. It's got one big problem associated with it, which is it's in a unit that nobody understands, and that's trillions of BTUs. So I know that many of you are familiar with BTU content of gas, but honestly, do you really equate BTUs to anything else? Probably not. We declared independence over 200 years ago. I'm not sure why we're still using the British thermal unit. But in any case, in order to make sense of this, I did the work of converting it into something we are more familiar with. So let's start with watts, okay? So watts in power and watts in energy. So let's take a refrigerator. Let's say when it's on, it uses about 500 watts. The minimal federal requirement of efficiency is actually a little bit lower than that. They range from 300 to 800. I just use 500 to make the math easy. And when that thing is on, it's using 500 watts of power, okay? If it's on for an hour, that means it used 500 watt hours, which is an energy measurement. The one on the left is power, the one on the right is energy. And for our purposes, I converted the following chart into megawatt hours. But here's an easy way of looking at this. If you're looking at the actual number on average in the United States, it's 400, not 500. If you have 400,000 watts per year, watt hours per year. So if you had a street with 25 refrigerators like that on it, you're looking at about a megawatt hour per year for 25 homes for their refrigerators. To give you a sense of scale, the 25 houses all have refrigerators, a megawatt hour per year for their refrigerators. So now let's look at that chart again. And I've helpfully converted every number on it into megawatt hours, including the supplies of petroleum, coal, natural gas, et cetera, not just the things that are already electrical, because you can measure the energy content of a barrel of oil. Lawrence Livermore did it in BTUs. I converted that to megawatt hours. And of course, these are all in millions because these are very large quantities of energy. So for example, 167 million megawatt hours worth of oil is used in the state, not produced, used in the state of Colorado. Take a look at these red dots because I'm going to refer to them later. This is all of the content for natural gas that winds up residential, commercial, industrial. Here's your total electricity generation in the state. This is a 2022 number, so it's slightly lower than other ones I'm going to present later. And here are the energy services. This is the actual energy value delivered to each of these sectors, and then the total combination of 151 million megawatt hours worth of energy services in the state. This all matters later, so I wanted to lay this out for you. The 4 dots on the right here show you what those energy services are for transportation, industrial, residential, and commercial use, and you can see the total here for each. It's a lot. It's a lot of energy services that we use to make our civilization go here in Colorado. I'm going to come back to those later repeatedly. Let's take a look at coal in the state as our first primary energy source. Two stories of coal here. One is that for roughly a quarter century, it's been generating about between 35 and 30 million megawatt hours per year. The decline has come recently in about the past decade, as it's gone from more in the 35 range to about the 30 range. And that has a lot to do with other forms of generation coming on and displacing that coal burn. But the overall number is not that different from 25 years ago. It's a little bit less, but not a lot less. The real story for coal coming up is the retirement of the remaining coal generation in the state. And you can see here, these are scheduled numbers. You can find these publicly by unit at each of the three facilities at Comanche, Hayden, and Craig. And so you can see these units currently. By the year end 25, we lose one of these. We lose more in 27. And then finally, we lose that last Comanche facility, that last unit there, by the end of 2031. It's gone. So nearly 2,800, whatever that number is, of firm generation of electricity, which we'll show proportions on later, is going away in a pretty short period of time, according to plans. That matters, and we'll come back to that later. Let's move on to hydro. I love this picture. This is right here in Garfield County. This is, I think, was commissioned in 1909, the Shoshone Generating Station, and is part of Colorado's hydro story. That story is mostly in the past. These are roughly divided up into 50-year blocks. So you can see that pre-1920, when it was just getting started, we didn't add very much. First unit was, I think, in 1890. The real 50-year interval was 1920 to 1970. Most of the actual growth occurred from the 40s to the late 60s. And then from 1970 to 2020, it's a shadow of that level of growth. And there really probably isn't going to be much generation added for hydro looking ahead. The plans looking into the future are all small single megawatt units for generation. So we can't really expect a whole lot more primary energy addition from hydro in Colorado. We do have contemplated the addition of a lot of hydroelectric storage, not generation. The two are different. Lots of times people equate those two things. They're not the same. Storage is a battery, so to speak, that you can charge up and then use. Generation is actually the thing that charges the battery. So this would be a really big hydroelectric battery, storing about 4,800 megawatt hours of electricity for use when the grid needs it most. And 4,800 megawatts sounds like a lot, or megawatt hours sounds like a lot, but keep in mind that's about 3% of a day's generation in the state. So it's not a giant number compared to the daily needs of the state. And those daily needs numbers are averages, by the way. Sometimes the actual number during peak demand is much higher. So that should be kept in proportion. This is in the earliest stage of permitting. It probably won't be in production until sometime in the early 2030s, based on online reports. That coal generation I mentioned earlier will be gone a few years before that, which is important to note. All right, let's switch to oil. Okay, so this probably is not drilling for oil. This is in Rio Blanco. It's likely drilling a dry gas well. Maybe there's some associated oil, but I was trying to find Colorado pictures that I could get the rights to, and the Western Slope won out here. So it's probably a gas picture for an oil topic, but forgive me for that. What's the story of oil production here in the state? Well, obviously the shale boom is gigantic. That's probably the big headliner here. When unconventional took off in the state, you see obviously this enormous ramp up. Another story, though, is this divot and decline. The United States broadly experienced this big drop during the pandemic era, kind of in that interval. But the country as a whole has recovered and actually exceeded pre-pandemic numbers. Colorado has not, and we're going to dig into that a little bit here. The two colors, by the way, are Front Range versus Western Slope, essentially DJ versus Piceance. Not a ton of oil out here, obviously. That's the blue bit, and the green is DJ. All right, here's a little bit of vintage information for this oil production. So continuous levels of activity are required in shale drilling to keep production flat. What each of these bands are essentially are vintages of well by year. And so you can see what all of you as operators know, which is the decline of these wells is very steep. Their production is very high, their IP is very high, but their decline is very steep. That's just a property of shale well drilling. And what it means is, of course, that when activity slows, production slows pretty fast, much more so than for conventional wells, which we'll see a bit in a minute. Our analysis of what we see, by the way, for available locations for drilling for oil in the Front Range indicate that at these levels and current price domains, we're looking at about 6 more years of production at these levels before production begins to decline. And that's just based on the quality of available inventory left. That said, prices, technology, and other things could change that picture. So that's a right now piece of knowledge, not a forever piece of knowledge. If we move out to gas, this is right here nearby in Parachute, gas well. Different story. We don't see as much decline in gas in that post-pandemic period. And I haven't, there's some ideas I have about why that might be true, but I didn't have time to verify those. In the Piceance, obviously we get this peak there in, I think, January of 12, if I remember right, either 12 or 13. And then, a slow tail off. Some of this could be attributed to relative economic competitiveness, basis differentials, et cetera. But I think regulatory regime may also play a role in this from conversations with a lot of folks before coming here. Here are the same declines for gas. You see that they're not as steep as they are for oil, and I think that the Piceance has a lot to do with that. There's a fair amount of directional drilling out here and vertical drilling. Those declines are more shallow. You put that together with the associated gas from the Front Range, and you get shallower curves. You also, you don't see nearly as big a ramp either because there was already a lot of gas being produced back in the day before unconventionals took off. There's the Front Range associated gas is going to plateau and decline much like the oil, but the Piceance has got tons of running room and a huge base of resource to go further. I heard a lot about permits when I talked to people before coming here, and I heard a lot more about permits over the steak fry last night, and then I heard more about permits at the after party at the Hampton Inn. This morning, our research group published a report from which this chart is drawn that shows the permitting trend in the state and also calls out Senate Bill 19181, where we went from the OGCC to the ECMC. The data are pretty clear. We had a pretty high volume of permits before, a big drop in 2019. The ECMC was established in April of that year, and it's been kind of down since. There's a British cybernetician named Stafford Beer who decades ago came up with a concept which is the purpose of a system is what it does. So not what it says it's supposed to do, but what it actually does. And so if you go with Stafford's view of this, I think it would say that the purpose of this COGCC was the timely approval of permits, and the purpose of the ECMC is slower approval of fewer permits. That's what the application of that thought process would say. I'm not saying that Stafford Beer's thought process is right. I merely present the data that you can see in the trend. I'll also give another thought on this. One of the operators who I'm not going to name because I'm not sure he wanted me to, talked about how permits that he used to file that might get approved in 60 days are routinely taking longer than 2 years. So I think the figure that he used was 27 months. I just like to point out that the time difference between when Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the authorization for the Manhattan Project and the Trinity test in the deserts of New Mexico was 41 months. This was the greatest, and probably still is, the greatest feat of science, engineering, and industrial might in the history of humanity. And it took 41 months. I would suggest that's instructive when we look at the time it takes to approve a permit. Let's talk about wind. The story of wind in Colorado is up and to the right. A very large increase in generation. Wind became economic to produce in relative terms, really about 15 years ago. The Danes charged off into that and led the technology development. And through a number of incentives, mostly tax-based incentives, it began to take off in places where there's a lot of wind. Colorado has great wind resource and a lot of open area, so it was a natural place for wind generation to take off, and it has done so. This generation number of 16 million megawatt hours a year is no joke. That's a lot of juice, and wind is providing it. Let's take a look at solar. Different story for Colorado and solar. The start is much later. You see it, about a decade after wind. And there's really a couple reasons why. The economics of solar were really just not very good until panel prices came way down, which they did around that time. And then later, you see a real inflection here as the incentives and the tax credits take off. So it's nearly a vertical slope. Not quite a quarter of what wind is producing today, but that number will almost certainly increase this year. Let's switch to nuclear. You guys used to have nuclear here. You actually did for a while. This is a Fort St. Vrain generating station. It used a relatively novel at the time form of reactor. It was a high temperature gas reactor. Very difficult for first-of-a-kind reactors to get tuned in and made work really well. It never really met the commercial goals of the folks that owned it, and so it was retired in the late 70s. It was perfectly fine and functional and safe. It was not profitable at the time. The technology had more development to be done. You haven't had nuclear since. You have mined a fair amount of uranium in the past, and there's talk about doing that again, but not nuclear. Now, recently, in what I think is a super encouraging, highly bipartisan effort, you got a bill passed just weeks ago that defined nuclear for Colorado as clean energy, which I think is a wonderful recognition of the truth and should be commended for the bipartisan nature of it. Great. Now, what do you actually do with that? Well, I want to talk a little bit about that. I got to spend time with some folks at Oak Ridge National Laboratory who were incredibly helpful for me in helping build this presentation. And what you see here is a series of regulations from the NRC. The first of these, we're kind of moving down a stair step here. They've done an amazing thing. They've applied these 3 sets of Nuclear Regulatory Commission regulations that define where you can put reactors and why. And they've added a layer of industry guidance on top of that. And then they've taken available data sources about land area throughout the continental United States and combined all of those things together to help figure out where you can even put one of these things. And I'm going to show you that in a minute. What affects these regulations and guidance are things like population density and distribution and other land use characteristics, how close are other forms of critical infrastructure, airports, highways, that kind of thing. And the physical characteristics, seismology, meteorology, geology, hydrology, all those kinds of things that are physical properties of the land. You combine all those together, and you're looking for things like risks of accident exposure and a bunch of other stuff, and you put it together into a holistic picture. What does that look like? Well, they take all these characteristics, and get this, they divided the United States, all of the continental United States, lower 48, into 100-meter squares. So squares 100 meters on the side. That's 700 million squares. And those of you with GIS backgrounds will appreciate that's a lot of polygons, right? And so that when you apply 60 site characteristics on top of 700 million squares, that's a pretty big number, which helps you appreciate why it's nice to have a supercomputer at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, because they use that to do what you're about to see. The next thing that they apply is, hey, we've got different types of reactors, and those get different guidance. So an AP1000, what they just built 2 of in Georgia recently, and a couple of reactors yet to be constructed, but much smaller in size and therefore more flexible to locate. Here are preliminary maps that they very kindly made for me for this presentation for you, which would show you the default settings on the machine, if you will, that indicate where you might be able to put a reactor as large as an AP1000. The green areas are from the initial run, areas that would have no issues according to the regulatory framework described in the industry guidelines, meaning kind of good to go based on community consent and further examination. It's not definitive. This is not a map that says where you should put a reactor. That's a community decision. There's a lot of regulatory people involved, and at the state level, lots of community involvement. This is not Oak Ridge National Laboratory telling you what to do. This is an examination of what seems possible based on the data and what we know about the regulations. The AP300, which I hasten to point out has never been built. It's a derivative of the AP1000, but none of them have ever been built yet. You can see it can go in more places. The smaller size and some other characteristics allow it to go in a little bit bigger footprint. And the XE100, X-Energy's 100 megawatt reactor, can go just about anywhere by comparison for a lot of reasons related to the characteristics of that device and the regulations. So again, I want to point out a couple things. Oops, this is not a definitive guide of where to put these things. It indicates what might be possible. It doesn't have to be green for you to put it there. It just means those are things that there's almost no issues there. When you see yellow, there's at least one issue that needs to be dealt with. That could be available water. It could be the slope of the land. It could be a number of different things that often have engineering solutions to them. And then the number, orange has got 2 and blue has got 3+. So what drive those things? Well, the biggest restrictions in Colorado are protected lands, stream flow. You got water in some places and not others, and slope, obviously mountainous terrain. Those are the 3 big things. You can deal with stream flow and slope a lot with engineering solutions, but protected lands is not an engineering problem. That's going to require so much that I think probably most developers would not even start the conversation. So that gives you a sense of what's driving those site selections in the state. So here's the overall message here. Colorado just said that nuclear is clean energy, wise and true. The good folks at Oak Ridge National Laboratory are ready, if the state government is ready, to help find where you might actually start putting these things. So it's not an insurmountable problem, and there's already a lot of help to define it. Now, some people obviously have doubts about nuclear on the basis not just of safety, but of cost. The facilities that were installed, or the reactors that were installed at the Plant Vogtle site, 3 and 4, those are those AP1000s. Man, they went 2.6 times over the estimated cost. Originally it was $14 billion, wound up at around 36, and 7 years later than originally planned. So very expensive and very late. If you want to learn about why that was, I've got a great series of podcasts to listen to. And when you listen to it, you're like, man, how did they ever even get them finished? Like, it's a miracle. Southern Company deserves a tremendous amount of credit for seeing this project through and blazing the path for this technology, which is now proven and working well. That's why Senator Granholm, former Energy Secretary Granholm, said at the commemoration of these units that we should build 200 more. I think she's right, personally. Colorado could be that place that some of them go. For fun, I compared Colorado and its generation mix to my own home state of South Carolina, where I grew up, and some interesting parallels. Population is not that different. By the way, my home state's going to blow by you guys in about 10 years because we're growing so much faster. Go Sandlappers. Your coal natural gas generation is about 36 million megawatt hours. South Carolina is about 38.8. Wind, solar, and hydro. Colorado's way ahead of South Carolina here, 16 million more megawatt hours than South Carolina. Colorado's a no-show on nuclear, and my home state's about 55% nuclear today. Observe the difference in electricity rates. A lot of people think that nuclear is inherently expensive, and that's simply not true. Reactors over time, after they're amortized, are very cheap to run and keep operational. They also emit zero carbon for those that care about that. So I think it's instructive to observe different generation mixes can produce similar cost outcomes, but these things last, these nuclear reactors last a really long time, 60 to 80 years of reliable service. So fun with state comparisons. I just thought that was interesting. Let's move on to geothermal. I thought this was going to be a really exciting thing to talk about until I talked to you guys before this. And the reason why I mean that is enhanced geothermal technology offers the promise of using great oil and gas industry technology learning to apply to a new form of energy. All that directional and horizontal drilling is exactly what you want for enhanced geothermal systems and advanced geothermal systems. Oxy, who I think is in the room, has got an advanced geothermal project approved, and I think they're moving ahead with that on the Front Range. Everybody else I talked to was like, yeah, that was before the new regulatory permitting regime for geothermal and here in the state, and most folks are not even considering it, sadly. So that's too bad because the resource potential is pretty good. Here's what enhanced geothermal looks like. Looks an awful lot like drilling horizontal wells. You drill a well down a good bit deeper than we normally do, and then into the basement rock, granite, fracture that granite, and essentially create a heat reservoir between a well that puts water down and a well that takes hot water up. And owing to the temperatures involved, you have to use what's called a binary system, which uses another fluid in the generator to basically, usually it's something like a propane or something like that, believe it or not, as the working fluid. So you heat it up, it kind of makes propane steam, runs through a turbine, creates electricity. And that's how enhanced geothermal works. What does the potential look like for in the state? Green is good, red is bad. So the green territory in western Colorado looks a lot like western Utah, where there's already a lot of traditional geothermal plants. There's also a school of thought among the geoscientists, by the way, that says that there's an underexplored reality here, and that the temperature gradients are actually a lot better than this map would appear, because the temperature sampling was not done all the way down to the basement rock. This is relatively old data. So we have, for example, in Texas, which has got pretty lousy resource compared to Colorado, as you can see over here in West Texas. It's according to the survey data, nowhere as near as good. Somebody disagrees out there. I can't remember who it was, but they're starting to drill for it. So they think there's something there. I'm guessing they know something that this map doesn't. So just sharing that. This is another view of the temperature gradients. You can see there's some really hot rock underground in Colorado. And here in the eastern Piceance and the DJ basins, we did the work of figuring out what the levelized cost of energy would be for electricity generation. And you can see it's pretty far down the curve. It's looking like approximately, oops, thought I had another slide there. It's in the, call it $80 range, probably, maybe all the way down. And that's pretty good. That's not a bad power cost, especially if you're prioritizing power that doesn't generate emissions. So the governor has talked a lot about the heat beneath our feet. The permitting regime doesn't seem to be encouraging people to explore it here, unfortunately. Okay, let's move on to power. So we've talked about energy and primary energy forms in the state, and we're going to talk about power in the state, first with some abstract concepts, okay? The first one I'm going to talk about is how do we value power, okay? And I want to rely on an outtake from a Bloomberg New Energy Finance article that came around 2020, and I'm going to read it to you. Renewables are the cheapest power option for 71% of global GDP and 85% of global power generation. It's now cheaper to build a new solar or wind farm to meet rising electricity demand or replace a retiring generator than to build new fossil-fired power plants. On a cost basis, wind and solar is the best economic choice in markets where firm generation resources exist and demand is growing. A lot of people skip the where firm generation resources exist part. We're going to talk about that in a minute. LCOE is the metric that people refer to a lot when they're talking about cost, levelized cost of energy. Levelized cost of energy was a metric created when all electricity was generated by thermal power plants, things that burn stuff to make electricity. All of those things that burn stuff to make electricity do one of two things. They either run all the time or they run when you tell them to. We now have resources on the grid that do neither of those things, but the same number is being used, and that creates a real value recognition problem. That's why a megawatt isn't necessarily a megawatt hour isn't necessarily a megawatt hour, and have you included all the costs become good questions. So let me put up a hypothetical for you to kind of make it easier to understand. Let's say that you've got two cars. One is the black car, and 99.9% of the time when you turn the key, it starts, it goes the speed you want to the place you need to get to and gets you there on time. The green car, which is your alternative, let's say it does that about half the time. And the other half of the time it doesn't go anywhere. Or doesn't get you where you need to be at the time you need to get there. The question is, would you pay the same amount of money for the car on the left and the car on the right? And my guess is the answer is going to be no, despite the fact that the car on the right never takes gas. You never have to put gas in it. But it's not a deterministic system. It doesn't do what you tell it to when you need. And so I think most of you would probably say you wouldn't pay as much for the car on the right as on the left. Well, that matters when we start looking at electricity. So old school thermal resources in the construct that was described in the BNEF piece are more expensive. They do one of two things. They're either running 24/7, 365 at whatever capacity factor they have, or they're ready on call when a grid operator needs to balance the grid. Things that are cheap and in that same language are available in favorable conditions. And so that's the difference in terms of value assignment. All right, why does this matter? Well, balancing a grid is really important. Supply must always exactly equal demand. Not sorta, not close, exactly. And when they don't, bad things happen. So normal grid operations have these in perfect balance. What happens when they go out of balance is not good. I lived through Winter Storm Uri in Texas when they went out of balance for several days. I had friends of friends who died by freezing to death in their homes. A passenger jet worth of people died in that storm, and many of them as a result of the loss of power. Either they froze because they didn't have electricity, they got in accidents that they wouldn't have gotten into if they weren't in dire straits, things like burning charcoal to try to stay warm and dying of carbon monoxide poisoning. It's a serious matter. Same thing happened with generators too. Grids are synchronous systems, meaning the power and the demand have to be matched all the time. They're synchronous in that way. And they have no graceful failure mode. They're either on or off. That's the reality of the alternating current grids that power our civilization, and that's not going to change. So these things have to be in balance with each other. So when you retire firm generation, and let's say you said you wanted to replace a coal-fired plant, for example, with wind or solar resources, this is not my math or Enverus's math. This is from an investor presentation from an independent power producer, Vistra Energy, and this is taken from one of their investor presentation decks. I just changed the style of it to match our PowerPoint deck. The numbers are the same. So on the left, you've got a 1,000 megawatt modern gas plant, and on the right, you've got a system that could be available as much as the gas plant is available by combining wind resources, solar resources, and a lot of battery resources to back the wind and solar up when it's nighttime or the wind isn't blowing. And to get to that continuous 1,000 megawatt, I'm sorry, that's a misprint, 1,000, no, that's right, 1,000 megawatts of power, you need about 1,300 times as much land and 9x the times capacity and about 10 times the investment per Vistra's numbers. Now, we kind of looked at this internally and said, hey, do we think that's right? We might disagree with a couple of their calculations. The gas plant might have been rated too cheap. The wind, solar, and batteries might have been rated a little bit too expensive. The capacity multiplier that you need on 9X might not be as high. But, I've seen other sources say that it's not 9, it's 7, other independent calculators. It doesn't really change the big picture. It's a whole lot more land and a whole lot more money to cause those resources to behave the same way, which is an important factor when we're thinking about the future of what it is that we want to do. Now we'll get to reality. I'm going to talk about myself for a minute. And the reason why is I'm about to download a whole lot of opinions here. And I believe that you should know the background of the people that are opining to you. And what drove their thoughts and their opinions. So I'm going to share that with you in my case. This is a gas line in the early 70s, 1973. One of my earliest memories as a person is sitting in the back seat of one of those cars while my parents were in the front seat, worried about whether or not they were going to get to the pump before the gas ran out. And in my house, at that age, that mattered. My mom and dad both punched a clock, and there wasn't much in the refrigerator. And whether or not they could go to work was a material thing for our home. That caught my attention. When you're 6 years old, your parents are like gods, right? They can do anything. What is this thing that's causing my parents, these super people, to be worried? And from that moment on, I was hooked on energy, and I have been ever since. I also learned a lot about the environment because I was a really sickly kid. I had a lot of problems. I had allergies to everything, really puny, half the size of kids my age. I just was in really poor health. And one of the things that I think had something to do with that was the environment at the time. My dad worked manufacturing jobs. We chased him all over the country, California, the Midwest, Georgia, South Carolina. We went wherever work was, and we moved a lot. But wherever that was often in places that looked like this. This is a Midwest industrial town in the 1970s. It really looked like this. Yeah, there was a lot of crap in the air back then. The EPA had not kicked in. And when I was a kid, I spent a week or two at a time in bed because I couldn't breathe. And I'm sure this didn't help. So, I remember what it was like before we had an EPA, and I remember what it was like before air pollution standards were upheld. It wasn't great. So, energy poverty sucked. So did not being able to breathe easily. Because my parents were people interested in these kinds of things and they wanted to feed my interest, our coffee tables had some pretty cool magazines on them when I was a kid, for my look. These were typical at the time. We were in an energy crisis. Gasoline was really expensive. So was every other form of energy. Heating your home, everything else. And back in those days, everything was about efficiency and finding anything that wasn't oil to power stuff. You see a concentrated solar plant here, future of solar power, all these crazy looking hatchback cars. Remember, we were driving land yachts back then. These things looked like golf carts to people. But there was all kinds of talk about changing cars. And I think NASA built this wind turbine just a few hours from where I lived at the time, trying to figure out whether or not wind energy was something that we could use. This is more than 50 years ago. So a lot of these things sound familiar. These were also on our coffee table. The first batch of magazines was more along my dad's line of interest. These were along my mom's. This was Mother Earth News. It was all about basically living off the grid. How could you homestead, essentially? Maybe that was a better way. Maybe we had a polluted environment and expensive energy that was unreliable because we're just using too much of it, and we need to revert to a way of life that needed less, that we were more in control of. And that was kind of what that thought process was about. So you see this little car. I actually saw this car being built at the Eco Village, which was in Hendersonville, North Carolina. We stayed there for a few days when I was a kid. I split wood to help heat our home in a fireplace and a wood stove. We never got a windmill, which is probably for the best. But the idea was you could charge your batteries and run your home with your own electricity, all the way 50-ish years ago. Despite my mom wanting to live off the grid, my dad worked at one of the largest coal-fired power plants on the eastern seaboard, Wynyard Generating Station, for 35 years. That coal plant provided the electricity that fed the paper mill where my mom worked for the same period of time. And it also fed the electricity that fired the steel mill where I worked when I worked through college. It used electric arc furnaces and natural gas to make steel, not coal, by the way, built in the 1960s. It is literally no exaggeration to say that coal put me through college and taught me a lot of things. So you've got some background on me. I don't like energy poverty. I don't think anybody should experience high costs for energy. I don't think that we should degrade the environment when we can avoid it. And I think we have to be realistic about what we can and can't do as a society. So that's my opinion shaping. Now, on for more of that. I don't know why this occurred to me, but I thought, hey, I wonder what Colorado's energy mix looks like and how it compares to the rest of the world. You've probably heard repeatedly the world uses about 80% hydrocarbons for all of its primary energy. I thought Colorado would be ahead. It's actually behind. It's 92% hydrocarbons for its primary energy. That fact might shock a lot of people based on sentiment in the state about energy and hydrocarbons in particular, but that's the current reality. This shows the story of generation versus emissions in the state over the past quarter century. You see generation here on the orange line increasing relatively quickly, and emissions coming down at about the same speed. Why is that? Demand growth, as it has occurred, has often been met with the very large growth of wind and solar in the state. The state has really good wind and solar resources compared to a great many geographies. You don't want to put a lot of solar in Germany, for example. LCOEs on solar in New York State are pretty poor. Wind in South Carolina, where I grew up, is basically not useful onshore. So Colorado is awash in every form of energy. You guys have got great wind, you've got a tremendous solar resource, tons of oil, tons of gas, a lot of uranium, you name it, Colorado's got it. So you were able to take the wind and solar resource and expand generation even while emissions came down. I think that this is a good way to think about wind and solar. They're essentially fuel conservation technologies. They are things that can avoid fuel burn. They can't replace fuel burn because, as we've already covered, they're not available all the time. The fuels that are used in this state, that's coal and natural gas, carry the weight of availability and reliability. But you can avoid some of the fuel burn by using wind and solar to get the generation when you can, and that is in fact what Colorado has done. So I think, again, you can think of wind and solar as technologies to conserve or displace fuel burn, but not replace it. We don't have the technology for that yet. All right, another piece of context. On the left is Colorado's total remaining coal capacity for power generation. On the right is not China's coal capacity, but the coal capacity they added in 2023. The numbers in 2022 were bigger. This is what China added in terms of coal capacity in 2023. And that's just China. That doesn't count India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Pakistan, et cetera, just China. Well, what would it look like if we compare the Colorado coal fleet to the existing Chinese coal fleet? The entire things. Tell me if you can find Colorado. I can't. Not even with tweezers. The numbers are just staggering in terms of the total fleet. That prior addition, by the way, sometimes people say, oh, well, that's just the gross additions. They also retired a bunch. Nah, this is the net number. This is the net number. And you've already seen the total number. So what does that mean in the context of eliminating Colorado coal for power generation? Well, I'd like to point out that coal, even today, is roughly half of the state's entire firm generation for electricity. And that's all supposed to go away in the next 6 years. And my question is, to be replaced by what? You can balance your grid today, and electricity costs aren't even that high compared to the national average. And I think that's a result of those dynamics I was talking about earlier. But when you take that away, well, that's going to get really interesting. Let's talk a little bit about production versus consumption of oil and gas, because I think this is also instructive. Here's the state's production in relatively current figures versus its consumption of oil. And the same thing for gas. Obviously producing significantly more oil than the state consumes, much more still even of gas. I'm going to come back to this later because I think it's a material point. But let's go back to coal generation replacement. Replacing today's coal generation requires adding all of the state's current wind and solar capacity again. So everything that's been added in the past 15 to 20 years, double it to replace all the coal going away in the next 6 for a sense of proportion. But it would also require, as we saw earlier in that chart, adding a ton of storage. GOBS is a very technical term. I didn't even try to figure out the math because it's just too big to matter. But also transmission. And transmission is actually more expensive than the generation, significantly so as time goes forward. We're not building transmission right now in the country for the most part. Okay, well, what if you wanted to replace coal and gas? Because there's a policy statement that says that's what the state's going to do. All right, well, that would be 2.8 times today's wind and solar capacity. Very much bigger numbers still. And even gobs more of storage and transmission, just for a sense of scale. Okay, let's take another replacement of fossil fuels. Here we've got the combined energy services. Remember energy services from earlier? This is the energy services supplied by gas in millions of megawatt hours for industrial, residential, and commercial use in the state. So if you were going to replace that, first take into proportion, that's roughly double today's grid in terms of energy services. So natural gas by itself is providing roughly twice the energy services to businesses, homes, and industry in Colorado than the grid is today. So if you wanted to replace that, you need to add double the current capacity of the grid, or basically triple today's grid in order to do that. Forget what's going to be giving you the electricity. You'd have to triple your grid to replace nat gas as an end-use fuel. That's a really daunting proposition, to put it mildly. What about Colorado's car fleet replacement rate? Well, you guys drive around 5.2 million vehicles. These are passenger vehicles, not trucks, or freight, rather. And what is, if you wanted to convert all of these to battery electric vehicles, it'd take about 23 years on the current vehicle purchase schedule or rate in the state if all 220,000 vehicles sold every year, like last year, were all BEVs, and every one of those vehicles replaced an existing vehicle. Okay? Neither of those things are true, but that's what it would take. Last year, BEVs accounted for just 43,000 of that 220, although it is growing fast. So if you just said, hey, just for the sake of steel manning the argument of replacing the entire fleet, let's say that we sold nothing but BEVs from today forward. It's still going to be a quarter century before the fleet turns over, which again is material when we think about energy decisions in the state. What would it take to electrify all those vehicles after we converted them? It's a good thing it's going to take a while, because that's 30.8 million megawatt hours of energy services. That would require adding 1.5 times today's wind and solar build just for transportation. So again, more gobs of storage, transmission, and in this case, distribution, because you've got to charge those cars where they are. And fast charging is simply not going to be how it's all done. You're going to have to get a lot of that to other places like people's homes. Okay, so what's the reality? Where's the conclusion here? Colorado's reality is that hydrocarbons and emissions are here to stay well past 2040 and even 2050. Why? Electrifying surface transportation is minimum a quarter century proposition. We just reviewed that. A massive grid expansion to rapidly replace natural gas end use would be impractical, expensive, and unwise to do for a lot of reasons. Building any firm generation resources that can replace coal and natural gas generation fleet fast enough to meet stated policy goals is simply unrealistic. That's just the truth of it. So then that leaves me with a couple of questions that I think it should leave you with, which is, why rush to shutter your coal fleet before you replace it? That's the key. I'm not saying that Colorado policy is wrong for wanting to replace its coal generation, despite the fact it put me through college. I appreciate the fact that it generates a lot of pollutants that have to be carefully managed, and there are other downsides as well, including the emissions. But why rush to replace it or retire it before you replace it? And then why drift toward a de facto ban on hydrocarbon production? We know that legislation has been proposed to outright ban the industry, and I wouldn't be surprised if it comes back. But there's more than one way to result that same effect. And I think we've touched on that already too. So what about responsibility? It's as necessary as it is difficult. What do we do? And I'm going to talk about this in relation to where our thoughts come from, how different members of society think about problems, what they're prioritizing, what we should take from it, and questions that I have in relation to this. And I think many others have as well. You might have noticed over the past few years that things aren't so great in a lot of ways. When I was coming out of college, one of the most popular songs was "The Future's So Bright, I Gotta Wear Shades." And that's actually what it felt like. I remember, I was there. I don't think you're going to find a lot of young people who feel that way today. And it's no surprise. I mean, let's just take geopolitics here. Every one of these people means us poorly, and they have a lot of power. These are adversaries of the United States of America and whatever allies we have at this point, and that's just the geopolitical stage. Conflict seems likely. I mean, China has all but scheduled the invasion of Taiwan. They haven't sent out invitations yet. I expect it to come. And we don't even need to go through the rest of these characters. You get the point. Globalization probably peaked somewhere in the 20-teens. It was already starting to unwind. Well, it's flying apart with tremendous speed today. And that matters because the world is becoming a more fractious and more dangerous place quickly. And this is no time to be short on energy. No time. There's never a good time. Now's a really bad time to be short on energy resources. So what about thought leaders here in Colorado? I would suggest these serious times right now aren't met with serious policies. This is right from the CEO from the Colorado Energy Office. And this is what Governor Polis campaigned on, which is 100% renewable energy by 2040. And I think we just reviewed the mathematical, I'll say, difficulty of that proposition. This document is still up on the CEO website. And my question is why? It appears impossible, so why is it still the stated policy? 100% renewable grid manifestly will not happen by 2040. It's just not going to, let alone all energy consumption in the state. And by the way, if somebody wants to produce math to the contrary, I'd love to see it. I have no pride of authorship here. I've just done arithmetic. If somebody wants to show me a plan that causes that not to be true, I think we'd all like to see it. Until then, I'm not sure why this is stated policy. Supporting math on this goal, or a more practical one, would be really helpful. All four of these people are prominent Coloradans who have a stake and a say in energy and the environment. I want to talk about each of them. We've got Governor Polis, Secretary Chris Wright, the new Secretary of Energy, a fellow named Emory Lovins. I'm not sure how many of you guys will know who he is, but he's been in Colorado a really long time and is part of the Rocky Mountain Institute. And Roger Pilkey Jr., which probably even fewer of you know who is, but everyone should. And he's currently of the American Enterprise Institute, formerly a professor in the Colorado University system, no longer, and I'll get into that in a minute. But let's review each of these thought leaders and their representation of society and dialogue I think we need to have. So Governor Polis, I took this from one of his State of the State addresses. The only long-term solution is to continue pursuing low-cost, reliable, renewable energy. We must end our reliance on costly fossil fuels, improve energy security, and save people money. Now, I happen to agree with a good part of the sentiment of this statement. I really like the part about improving energy security and saving people money, being conscious of what energy costs. Remember my experience as a child. Costly energy is bad. I just don't agree with this part of the statement, which is the only long-term solution is part. And I think it's, I don't know Governor Polis. I've never met him. And I think the right thing to do when you don't know someone is to assume positive intent, which I'm doing here. I don't think the man means poorly. I just think he's got some facts wrong here. And maybe the recognition of nuclear energy as clean energy is part of a change in view in terms of how goals can be achieved, which would be welcome. I'm pointing out Governor Polis's point of view because this reflects a lot of views of the people here in Colorado as well. And the way that views are changed is by us engaging with each other in productive dialogue, and I'm going to keep coming back to that. Here's Secretary Wright. This is a lightly edited quote that I took from a video that I saw Secretary Wright deliver live. It couldn't be more different than the governor's sentiment. Net zero by 2050 is unachievable by any practical means, but while the aggressive pursuit of it has not delivered any benefit, it's delivered tremendous costs. Now, clearly, I just demonstrated electricity prices have not gone up very much in Colorado. At least that's not what the EIA data say. Somebody here earlier today was talking about a utility bill that had gone up by 50%. Hopefully, not many people are experiencing that. But in any case, Secretary Wright was delivering this address to an audience in the United Kingdom, and their electricity prices are catastrophic. Their country is quickly deindustrializing. I mean, very rapidly. Businesses are leaving very quickly because they can't. They literally cannot afford to run their business in the United Kingdom. And energy costs, especially electricity, are the primary driver. So he was speaking to that audience, but this should be a warning of what happens when your electricity gets too expensive. Electricity is not a negotiable need. When you need it, you need it. And when it's really expensive, bad things happen. The thing that I might like to hear from Secretary Wright sometime is his thought on, okay, I totally get it on energy security. I'm 100% all in on the fact that we should have low-cost, reliable energy. I agree that trying to cliff hydrocarbons off of our energy mix is a mistake. What about the long term? Like, think about if a decadal, many decades transition time is required to shift safely from more and more hydrocarbons to something else, when are we going to have that plan? Like, what would we do? I think he's an avid supporter of nuclear power, both in rhetoric and his own investments, as I understand it. So, that part's good. But I think speaking to people who are really concerned about carbon emissions in a way that they might understand that the really long game does get us there somehow at some point, I think would be wise. The Secretary's a busy man, and he's got a lot of good things going on, so I'm not going to quibble too much. I'm going to quibble here. The ideas in the Mother Earth News Catalog, like kind of do all your own energy, get off the grid, small is beautiful, big is bad, that kind of thinking was directly related to Amory Lovin's work in the 70s and 80s. And, those ideas were bad when they were on my 8th grade coffee table. They're worse now. And the only consistent thing that has been true about Mr. Lovin's stated energy policies is that nuclear is bad. For 50 years, nuclear is bad. And this statement, even if nuclear power were clean, safe, economic, assured of ample fuel, and socially benign per se, it would still be unattractive because of the political implications of the kind of economy it would lock us into, which I translate to as, I don't need to understand this technology. I just don't like it, and neither should you. That's not an argument. I think we should move on. Roger Pielke Jr. I have great admiration for this man. I got to speak to him earlier this week in preparation for this presentation. This is a money quote from his book, The Climate Fix. If there is an iron law of climate policy, it is that when policies focused on economic growth confront policies focused on emissions reductions, it is economic growth that will win out every time. His point being, if you try to jam high costs on people, it's not going to work, right? Germany is a great illustration of what happens when energy security and cost collide with climate goals. No country is more all in on an energy transition than Germany has been. They've spent colossal sums of money on it. The Ukraine war, followed by their disastrous decision to shut down their last 3 nuclear reactors, has put the company in grave peril. It's deindustrializing nearly as fast as England. And I think it's a proof of the iron law. I think there's a way to misread this, by the way, which is everything's going to be fine, reality's going to win in the end. Please do not discount how much damage can be done along the way to this realization. It can be really bad. And if you want examples, I offer up for your consideration the United Kingdom, Germany, several other countries in Europe, Australia in its current trajectory, and neighboring California, where electricity rates are among the highest in the country. So, Roger has many other good ideas. We don't have time to talk about them, unfortunately, but great thinker. I want to add here that he's also been persecuted very badly. So Roger will open a lot of his meetings, at least he did with a meeting that I hosted for him once, by saying climate change is real, serious, and we should do something about it. And I think he's believed that for a long time. He wrote a book called The Climate Fix. But his view also, based on data directly from the UN IPCC, is that it's not an apocalyptic problem. It's a problem, but it's not an apocalyptic problem. And the solutions to it that we pick as a result are really important, and they shouldn't violate this iron law. That point of view, essentially for that point of view, and also for pointing out that the UN's own data don't show a clear correlation between climate changes and more severe hurricanes, as an example, he was basically investigated by Congress because a congressman in a nearby state called for an investigation to say, well, you must be getting funded by the fossil fuel industry to say such things. He was dragged in front of Congress. He had all his stuff in the Colorado University system peeled through. He got zero support from the university system through all of this and managed to keep his job as a tenured professor after it. But imagine going through that process. And then, if you want to see what he went through after that, there's a great article that he wrote in Reason magazine titled, How to Get Rid of a Tenured Professor. And it is a shameful, shameful catalog of what was done to him over a number of years to push him out without firing him. And I encourage all Coloradans to read it. And the reason why is we should not try to silence each other. It's just wrong. Nobody has a monopoly on the truth. And I commend Dr. Pielke for his incredible courage and standing for the truth and the facts, despite the great harm to him personally. I have no critiques of Roger. We should all be like Roger. That's what I have to say about that. So, what about some recommendations? I have 3 personal recommendations and 3 policy recommendations. The first personal recommendation goes right off of what I just said. Let people speak and listen. You will be surprised at what you pick up and learn when you talk to somebody with whom you disagree. And if it's a respectful conversation, the same thing happens in reverse. We have to be able to do this with each other. The polarization that we're experiencing is simply not okay. Our times are too serious to be divided. And it starts with the courage of talking to each other respectfully. The progressive and conservative impulses are both to a better future. Neither has a monopoly on the truth, but when one tries to gain a monopoly, catastrophe follows. Let me talk about progressive and conservative impulses. I'm really glad that the word progressive has replaced liberal, by the way, because it's actually more correct. It's actually the right way to think about it philosophically. The progressive impulse aims to change things for a better future. That's what it's about. It's kind of where it originates. Take where we are now, modify it, make it better. The conservative impulse is be careful to not appreciate what you already have. Make sure that you're careful not to damage something on your way to a better future. You need both. Without both, you swing into bad places. Without a progressive impulse, society stagnates, it becomes restrictive, it doesn't adapt to change. Without a conservative impulse, you can create disaster really quickly. So you need both of those things for a better future. We should work together and in good faith begin by assuming positive intent from the other person. If we limit our civic participation to the ballot box, you're basically gambling with the future. You're not planning for a better one. If it's all down to who wins the next election, you've already lost. I'm just going to tell you that now. Civic participation is about more than voting every few years. It really is. There are great organizations in this state that are aimed at helping create a broader awareness through civic participation about energy. Colorado desperately needs more of that. So does the country. Respect Chesterton's fence. This is G.K. Chesterton, is an intellectual from the first half of the 20th century in the UK. And it's essentially a restatement of what I was saying. Reforms should not be made until the reasoning behind the existing state of affairs is understood. Real simple statement. Too often reforms, either from a conservative impulse or a progressive one, assume that the people that came before us didn't know what they were doing or didn't mean well. That is a bad presumption. We should not operate that way. We should continue to work to remove that assumption from our culture. Not respecting the contribution of our forebears is just dumb. Do math and do it yourself. With a few exceptions of some trend data like the permits and the oil and gas production trends, pretty much everything I showed you today was not Enverus data. It was from sources like the Energy Information Administration. And I'd made that choice deliberately because if people want to improve upon or correct what I said, they can go get the data and look at themselves, do the math, and tell me where I messed up. But here's the thing. The math I did, y'all, it was arithmetic. It was addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. You don't need anything more than a few government websites and a simple Excel sheet, and you'll get right where I did. And the point is, this is too important to leave somebody else to do the math. And the more powerful you are and the more influence you have in society, the more that's true. If you're trusting a think tank, which, by the way, they don't think. What they do is they take in money to create arguments to make you think. But if you're trusting organizations like that to do the math for you, you're making a mistake. Do the math yourself, especially if you're influential in society. It's not hard. It just takes a little bit of study and the ability to face things honestly. If you can, produce what you consume. We showed on the slides earlier that Colorado produces more oil than it consumes and more gas than it consumes. But here's my key question. You're going to be using that oil and gas for a long time. Why would you slide into a de facto ban of the industry? You're just going to bring it in from somewhere else. What economic sense for the state does that possibly make? It's just foolish. And I can't understand why policy would drift in that direction. Engagement's the only thing that's going to stop it. Replacement before retirement. Giving firm retirement dates for critical resources without replacing them first is folly. We should not do that. A guiding principle for policymaking should be that resources are replaced before they're retired. I called my dad about this presentation last week. Remember, he worked for 35 years at a coal-fired power plant, and I described to him this situation. And he said, well, he was shocked. He said, well, surely they're going to replace the coal plants before they retire them, because as a worker on the grid, he saw that happen during his career. And I was like, no, Dad, the retirement dates are set. The replacement plan is I don't know what at this point. And he said, that's very bad. So it's a simple rule. I like simple rules because simple rules give rise to complex and intelligent behavior. Lots of complicated rules give rise to stupid and simple behavior. This is a simple rule, and I think Coloradans should campaign for it and demand it from their leaders. Replace something with something of equal value before you retire it. And remember the value description of electricity generation. Not all electricity generation is the same, and just because the nameplate number on the plant is the same does not mean it's equally valuable or that it behaves the same way. Try it before you buy it. Here's a last policy suggestion. Before you want to say, for example, that you replace every single generator on the grid with a new resource, maybe pick an area and just try it first in one place. Why not? Like, I wish I had time to do this. I almost did. I was going to take Boulder County. It's about 5% of the state's population. Look at the electricity generation it would need on a per capita basis. Replace it with 100% renewable, because that's the stated policy objective. Develop a price plan, show it to the community, and see if they still want it. Why not do that first? Let's learn something before we try it everywhere all at once. So that's it. I've gone slightly over time. I'm really sorry. Here are credits and thanks. I had a couple dozen interviews, a lot of government and other data sources, a whole lot of licensed artwork for the presentation to make it specific to Colorado. There's one credit missing here, which is the fellow that helped make this presentation comprehensible and pretty. His name is Chuck Mallory. He's also from Colorado. So just point that out. Thank you, Chuck, and thank you, everybody. That's it.
All right, y'all, please line up for your questions for our keynote. We have our microphones there. Or shout it out.
I might have missed it. What about hydro?
The question from the audience is, what about hydro? So my opinion that I shared is I don't think hydro generation, like adding a lot of generation capacity, has much hope in the state. You've got good terrain for hydro, and in some places I think good water resources. But hydro, it impounds a lot of land. And that land might be important from a natural resources perspective. People might live on it. Before the Craig Hayden Pumped Storage Facility got underway with a early stage permitting that it's going on right now, Xcel Energy did an even bigger one at Uniweep. It was going to be, I think, about a third bigger than the Craig Hayden facility that's proposed. It was going to basically require seizing the homes of 14 property owners. And other people had concerns about the geological significance of the Uniweep Canyon. It's the only canyon in the world that has exits going in both directions of water. It's kind of special. I don't know that the facility would have really interfered with that much, but you can see community resistance goes big with something that takes up a lot of land. I just don't think it has much of a future in the state. I could be wrong, but I don't think it does.
Jimmy, that was a great presentation. Over here, Steve Soychak with Colorado Mesa University. I'm straight ahead of you.
Okay.
Anyway, great presentation. Bank of America has come out with a chart of investment decisions, choosing which kind of generation source you should use. And they've recently updated their chart to use levelized full system cost of electricity.
Yeah.
I think it was written by Robert Idell at Rice University. He did the math.
Yeah.
And he calculated that wind and solar is like up to 8 times higher when you throw all the other gob of stuff you're talking about, when you throw in the extra backup, reliability, and everything else. So, you know, what they're showing is you can't use levelized cost of electricity to compare dispatchable versus non-dispatchable sources.
Yeah. So they're not, that's a great point. Thank you for pointing that out. They're not alone. LCOE numbers are getting revised by a lot of different organizations. There's a group at UT that I'm aware of that's working on something similar right now at University of Texas, Austin. I didn't get a chance to put this in. I was going to, you can see it was already a lot of material. But I would like to propose something that I call levelized cost of power. Grids don't run on energy, they run on power. Remember, power demand and power supply must always equal each other. So I think of them as we should think of them as balance of power. So they run on power. So what's the levelized cost of power? Well, if you're a grid dispatcher and you need to keep the grid up, which we need to keep the grid up, then the things that have value to you are the things that are always there or there when you tell them to be. And so in my opinion, what you would want to do to understand the full system cost is to do something maybe similar to what Bank of America did, which is to say, hey, make that thing behave in one of 2 ways. Either it's there on call or it's there all the time. The there all the time cost, I think, gets really high if you're talking about wind and solar because of the amount of capacity you need and the amount of backup you need, or storage rather. But that's probably not how we want to use those resources anyway. I think, as I showed earlier, if you use them as fuel conservation, Colorado hasn't experienced that much rate increase, but it's taken emissions down a fair bit. And if that's a goal that the state wants to pursue, that's not unreasonable. Maybe making those resources behave on call or more predictably is the system cost that should be taken in effect for that use. That's a policy decision that the state would need to make based on emissions goals and other things. But I do think it's important to distinguish between levelized cost of energy and something that's more reflective and doesn't kind of distort and compare resources in a way that they're not really comparable.
Over here in the corner.
Yes.
Ben Atkins, I'm with Weld County. Something that I have heard about and read recently in the last year and a half or so is about these new planned nuclear generators where, in theory, because they haven't been able to put them out yet, but plants that are ready to take over at a coal-fired site where they can, instead of retiring a coal plant, they just take out the coal burner and install a new next-gen nuclear plant. And going back to where you started at the beginning of nuclear generation being a new concept and a new ability here in Colorado. However, it does violate that last rule that you cannot replace that coal plant until it's been retired. I just wondered, do you have any thoughts on that? Have you heard of that, of taking the coal plant with its existing infrastructure and everything's right there and just changing the heat generation from burning coal to splitting atoms?
Yeah, so what you get to reuse in that scenario, there's a lot of people talking about that. It's basically redevelopment of coal facilities. There's been national discussions of that. What you would probably get to be able to reuse is the grid resources, the switchgear, the transmission, the transformers, that kind of stuff. You know, I would presume a lot of it would be reusable. Certainly the transmission would. Everything else goes away. Like no part of the coal plant would be reused, I don't think. I can't imagine how it could be based on the requirements of nuclear construction. They're just too different. So the coal plant would need to go away entirely and be replaced by a nuclear plant. Now you could possibly redevelop the nuclear plant next to the coal plant and then retire the coal plant after the nuclear plant synchronizes to the grid. That's theoretically possible, I guess. But there's a lot of variables. Like if you look at, for example, Comanche, which is the biggest remaining facility in Pueblo here in Colorado, I don't think it exactly equals an AP1000. It's close. So you would think about that. You probably want to build 2 AP1000s at a time, not one. You just get so much more economy on your second rep than you do from just doing one at a time. So these are complicated decisions. And by the way, new gen nuclear, like an AP300 or a BWRX300, those things are starting to show up in the order pipeline. Canada's got, I think, a BWRX300 in the queue for the Darlington site, but they've never been built yet. So, you know, the first of a kind is always slow and expensive. And until they're proven, you can't really count on them. So love me some nuclear, but I think if Colorado leans into that, and I hope it does, and I know some great folks at Oak Ridge National Laboratory that would love to help you, but it's going to take a while, realistically. And so it's important to get started soon.
Jeffrey Moore, City of Aurora, same topic. On those small nuclear modular reactors, do you have information on the permitting cycle? Like, how long do those take to get permitted?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on that. It's a long time, is the easy way to put it. Like, you've got to start early. I would say that, I know some people are, by the way, if you want to be connected to them. What I would say is that I think where Colorado should start is community engagement and interest. Like, find places that want them. You will find places that want them if you search. You will get communities that say, put it here. Guaranteed. You just got to look for them. And yeah, there'll be some people that need persuading. There always are, no matter what you're building. But I'd start there, because no matter what the permitting cycle is, it's going to go faster if the community's already bought in.
Thank you.
Yep.